The bloody end to a high-profile scandal rocked a small American town. A teacher, facing dozens of allegations of sexual relations with a student, found himself at the center of a horrific drama. What began as an investigation culminated in murder, leaving behind shock and horror. The story begins in a small American town, where life flowed smoothly and predictably. At the center of it all was a middle-aged, married English teacher with children. Neighbors and colleagues alike viewed him as a respected figure, quiet, polite, and disciplined. His family was considered exemplary, and his career was thriving. He had worked at the school for over 10 years, earned the trust of his students, and the administration considered him one of the most responsible employees. However, behind this seemingly benign appearance, alarming signs began to lurk. The first rumors surfaced several years before the events that rocked the country. Some students noted that the teacher was paying special attention to older girls. He stayed after school, offered extra help with subjects, and invited them to discuss assignments in an informal setting. At first glance, all this might have seemed like a sign of concern and professional interest. But gradually, such situations raised questions among both colleagues and parents. Despite the wariness, no official complaints were filed for a long time. Parents preferred not to raise the issue publicly, fearing damaging their children's reputations and causing conflict with the teacher. The school administration also took no decisive action, limiting itself to private conversations. The teacher himself steadfastly denied any suspicions and continued to act as if everything was merely speculation. The turning point came when one of the students, a 16-year-old girl, shared details of her encounters with the teacher with her friends. According to her, the relationship extended far beyond the classroom and was intimate in nature. Soon, the conversations reached the parents and then local law enforcement. The police launched an investigation, interviewed classmates and colleagues, and seized correspondence from instant messaging apps and social media. It emerged that contact between the teacher and student had indeed been regular and had lasted for several months. Moreover, stories gradually emerged from other girls claiming that the teacher had behaved in an intrusive manner, violating their personal boundaries. At this time, the teacher's family came under intense pressure. His wife initially refused to believe what was happening, insisting her husband was incapable of such actions. But local media reports, details of the investigation, and the growing number of charges forced her to admit the situation was spiraling out of control. This was a real blow to the school. Parents appealed en masse to the administration, demanding the teacher's suspension and an internal investigation. The city began talking about the complete failure of the oversight system. Public opinion quickly turned against the accused, and his former reputation as a respected figure was completely destroyed. Thus began a chain of events that would corrode the small community from within. Each new fact revealed to the investigators undermined the teacher's credibility and heightened tension around the case. What had recently seemed insignificant and unconfirmed turned into a criminal investigation with dozens of incidents. The police investigation gradually uncovered new details. Initially, it seemed like a one-off incident between a teacher and a student, but the evidence gathered indicated a systematic pattern. Investigators established that the first contacts between the teacher and the student began when she was not yet 16. The teacher exploited his position and trust. Under the guise of extracurricular activities, he invited the student to stay after school, promising to help her prepare for exams and college applications. Gradually, the interactions became personal, messaging on social media, exchanging photos, and late-night phone calls. The student admitted to feeling pressure from an adult in a position of power and authority. At first, she hesitated to resist, but later, having become emotionally involved, she found herself dependent on the teacher. When this information became known to the investigators, the scope of the case rapidly escalated. Soon, new victims emerged, ready to testify. Girls who had already left the school decided to speak out about their experiences, claiming that similar situations had occurred before. Some claimed the teacher used the same tactics, instilling trust, promising help with their studies, and then gradually drawing them into personal relationships. The key moment was the filing of 52 new charges at once. Each incident was documented in detail. The location of the meetings, the content of the correspondence, and witnesses confirming the intimacy between the teacher and the students. The investigation classified the teacher's actions as multiple counts of sexual abuse against minors. Public reaction grew stronger with each passing day. Parents demanded strict measures, fearing for their children's safety. Local newspapers published articles detailing the latest incidents. Television channels descended on the town, filming reports outside the school building. For community residents, the story became the main news story, eclipsing all other events. Meanwhile, the victimized student who initiated the investigation found herself in the spotlight. Her family faced public pressure. Some expressed support, while others accused the girl of deliberately making contact. For the student herself, this became a difficult psychological ordeal. She was forced to give numerous statements, undergo consultations with psychologists, and participate in interrogations. The defendant's position remained unchanged. He denied guilt. Through his lawyers, he claimed the relationship was consensual and nonviolent. However, the law clearly defined the age of consent, and the defense's arguments could not exonerate him from criminal liability. Moreover, the number of charges made the teacher's position extremely vulnerable. Even if some of the incidents were not proven, the remaining ones would be sufficient to impose a harsh sentence. At the same time, an internal investigation was launched at the school. The principal and administration testified about what they knew and what measures they took. It emerged that several years earlier, isolated complaints had been received from parents, but the investigation had been limited to formal interviews. This caused even greater controversy, as it seemed the school's leadership preferred to keep the matter under wraps. Tensions rose in the city. For some residents, the incident became an example of how a seemingly respectable person could conceal criminal inclinations. For others, it was a painful blow to the reputation of the entire community. Students discussed the case among themselves, and many parents temporarily transferred their children to other schools, fearing a recurrence. Thus, by the time the second stage of the investigation concluded, the case had become a major criminal trial, involving dozens of incidents and several victims. The teacher, recently considered a role model, was now perceived as the main culprit in this high-profile scandal. The charges against him grew increasingly serious, and the upcoming trial promised to be difficult and lengthy. After additional charges were filed, the case expanded beyond a local matter and became a national issue. The police press service officially confirmed that more than 50 charges related to sexual contact with minors had been brought against the schoolteacher. The statement emphasized that these were not isolated incidents, but rather a systematic violation of the law. From that moment on, the investigation became the center of media attention. Journalists descended on the school and courthouse daily. Cameras recorded every appearance of the accused, and newspaper headlines grew louder. National television channels included reports on the case in their evening newscasts. The story of the teacher, long considered an exemplary educator and family man, aroused particular interest among viewers as it combined several themes: trust in schools, issues of upbringing, and the moral responsibility of adults for the safety of children. Public opinion was divided. Some demanded the harshest possible punishment, considering the teacher's actions a monstrous betrayal of trust. Others emphasized the need to uphold the presumption of innocence and feared that public pressure could influence the trial. Overall, however, the outcry was so strong that the defendant's reputation was completely destroyed. The teacher's family faced intense pressure. His wife and children were condemned by neighbors and friends. The children faced ridicule and insults at school, and his wife withdrew from public life. The accused relatives tried to avoid commenting to the press, but journalists constantly harassed them outside their home. The defendant himself appeared at the hearings in handcuffs and accompanied by security guards. His lawyers attempted to mitigate the situation, arguing that most of the charges lacked evidence and that some of the testimony was contradictory. Nevertheless, Each new media publication increased public pressure on the court and the jury that would ultimately render a verdict. Tensions were mounting in the city. Parents of school children held meetings demanding greater transparency and security measures from the administration. Spontaneous pickets were organized in the streets outside the courthouse. Posters demanding justice and child protection became a familiar part of the city's atmosphere. Local authorities were forced to respond. School district representatives held an official press conference, acknowledging the shortcomings of the oversight system and promising to review internal teacher oversight procedures. But such statements only fueled outrage. Many residents believed such measures were too late and could not reverse what had already happened. By this point, the case had become a symbol, an example of how crimes within the school system can remain hidden for years. Each new charge added further detail to the overall picture, demonstrating that the problem affected not just one family, but an entire community. Thus, by the middle of the trial, a powerful wave of public condemnation had formed around the accused. His name had become a household word, and the investigation itself was a topic of discussion far beyond the small town. The next stage is preparation for the court hearings and witness interviews, promised to be even more tense and dramatic. Once the investigation was completed, the case went to trial. Preparations for the hearing took several months. Prosecutors assembled their evidence, defense attorneys gathered documents, and the public closely followed every step. The atmosphere surrounding the upcoming trial was extremely tense. The media published daily reports on the defendant and covered the reactions of city residents. The court hearing began with the reading of the indictment. It contained over 50 counts, including sexual assault against minors, abuse of office, and violation of student custody regulations. The judge emphasized the case's exceptional public significance and warned the parties to strictly adhere to procedural rules. The first hearings included testimony from the victims. The girls described how the teacher had lured them into relationships using his authority. Their testimony was accompanied by correspondence, data from phones and electronic devices, and expert opinions. Each testimony was a difficult ordeal not only for the victims themselves, but also for the audience. Journalists recorded every detail, and the publication of these materials caused widespread controversy. The defendant's defense strategy centered on attempting to cast doubt on the credibility of the testimony. The lawyers argued that some of the witness statements were contradictory and that the correspondence could have been taken out of context. They cited possible pressure from the police and the public, which allegedly turned the girls against the teacher. However, prosecutors relied on the systematic nature of the incidents. In their version, the similarities in the testimonies of various victims and the teacher's similar behavior patterns indicated that these were deliberate actions. They also presented testimony from colleagues and parents who confirmed the accused's suspicious behavior long before the official investigation. The courtroom was tense. The parents of the victims attended the hearing, demanding justice. The defendant's wife also appeared in the courthouse several times, but avoided speaking to journalists. Dissension within the family was brewing. Some relatives refused to support the defendant, while others continued to insist on his innocence. The court also heard testimony from psychologists, who explained how an adult in a position of authority could exert pressure on teenagers. Their findings strengthened the prosecution's case, demonstrating that minors' consent cannot be considered a defense. At the same time, the teacher himself maintained a denial during questioning. He claimed that all relationships were consensual and that some of the accusations were the result of misunderstandings or exaggerations. The judge interrupted him several times, demanding that he answer only to the point. By the end of the series of hearings, it became clear that the trial would be long and arduous. The evidence against the defendant appeared voluminous and compelling, but the defense continued to hope for a mitigated sentence or for some of the charges to be declared unproven. Thus, the trial became an arena where the harsh positions of the prosecution and the desperate attempts of the defense clashed. Each hearing heightened public interest, and the verdict awaited by the city's residents and the entire country drew ever closer. The final stage of the trial was supposed to conclude with a verdict, but events took a tragic turn. As the court hearings drew to a close, rumors circulated in the city that the defendant was preparing a plea bargain in which he intended to admit only part of his guilt. The defense team discussed the possibility of a plea bargain with the prosecutor's office, but this option met with resistance from the victims and their families, who demanded the maximum sentence. The situation surrounding the defendant's family grew increasingly tense. His wife filed for divorce, and the children were being cared for by relatives. The family's home was repeatedly targeted. Offensive graffiti appeared on the fence, and threats were dropped into the mailbox. Journalists maintained a 24-hour vigil outside the building. The defendant, in custody, received threatening messages from unknown individuals, warning that the verdict could be only the beginning of retribution. The climax came the day the murder was announced. The accused was found dead in his cell. The investigation determined that he died from multiple injuries. Whether it was a murder committed by fellow inmates or a planned massacre remained a matter of debate. Prison officials claimed that security had failed to act properly, and a separate investigation was launched. News of the murder spread quickly across the media. Some interpreted his death as a natural outcome of a high-profile case, while others raised questions about a person's right to a fair trial, even with dozens of charges against them. The victim's relatives stated that the incident was a failure of the system, which was supposed to ensure the safety of prisoners, regardless of their status. For the families of the victims, the defendant's death came as an unexpected ending. On the one hand, many perceived it as a symbolic end to the case, where justice was served before the official verdict. On the other hand, some parents expressed dissatisfaction, as the trial had not concluded and the case remained legally unfinished. The school community found itself in a state of deep crisis. The school administration fired several employees who had been named as witnesses in the case and announced the implementation of new personnel monitoring policies. Students and parents continued to discuss the incident, and many teenagers sought help from psychologists. For several weeks, the city held meetings to discuss issues of safety and trust in educational institutions. The case served as a lesson for local authorities. They decided to create an independent commission to oversee school employees and strengthen cooperation with law enforcement. But these measures were perceived as an afterthought, and the public was reluctant to believe in their effectiveness. The media continued to revisit this story for a long time. Documentaries, newspaper investigations, and analytical articles discussed not only the teacher's actions, but also issues of social responsibility, the role of school administration, the work of the police, and the judicial system. The story became an example of how a hidden problem within the educational environment can turn into a catastrophe for an entire community. Ultimately, the murder of the accused did not relieve the tension, but rather added a special touch of tragedy to the case. No legal resolution was reached, and for many involved, the events remained unfinished. Nevertheless, the story has remained entrenched in the public consciousness as one of the most shocking and devastating in the city's history. What began as an investigation into a school scandal ended with the death of the main suspect and the ruined lives of dozens of people. The case became a symbol of the failure of the oversight system and a reminder of how a crime within an educational institution can shake an entire community.